that authoritarian government is efficient. It doesn't waste time in argument or debate. Strong men get things done. Historical experience should warn us that this idea is almost always wrong. The concentration of power in a small number of hands and the absence of wider deliberation and scrutiny enables governments to make major decisions on the hoof without proper forethought, planning, or research. Within the government's own ranks, it promotes loyalty at the expense of wisdom and flattery at the expense of objective advice. The want of criticism encourages self-confidence, and self-confidence banishes moderation and restraint. Authoritarian rulers sustain themselves in power by appealing to the emotional and irrational in collective opinion. The present government's mishandling of COVID-19 exemplifies all of these vices. Whatever one might think about the merits of the decisions, it is impossible to think well of the process which produced them, which can only be described as jerky, clumsy, inconsistent, and poorly thought out. There is not and never has been an exit plan or anything that can be described as a long-term strategy, only a series of expedients. The Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons reported in July that the lockdown had been announced without any kind of cost-benefit analysis or advanced planning for its disruptive economic effects. So many relevant social and educational considerations were disregarded in favour of an exclusive concentration on public health issues, and not all of those. These are classic problems of authoritarian government. It is habitually inefficient, destructive, blinkered, and ultimately not even popular. The British public has not even begun to understand the seriousness of what is happening in our country. Many, perhaps most of them, don't care, and won't care until it's too late. They instinctively feel that the end justifies the means, the motto of every totalitarian government which has ever existed. Yet, what holds us together as a society is precisely the means by which we do things. It's a common respect for a way of making decisions, even if we disagree with the decisions themselves. It is very difficult to respect the way in which this government's decisions have been made. It marks a move to a more authoritarian model of politics, which will outlast the present crisis. There is little doubt that for some ministers and their advisors, this is a desirable outcome. The next few years will see a radical and lasting transformation in the relationship between the state and its citizens. And with it will come an equally fundamental change in our relations with each other, a change characterized by distrust, resentment, and mutual hostility. In the nature of things, authoritarian governments fracture the societies which they govern. The use of political power as an instrument of mass coercion is corrosive. It divides and it embitters. In this case, it's aggravated by a sustained assault on social interaction, which will sooner or later loosen the glue that has helped us to deal with earlier crises. The unequal impact of the government's measures erodes any sense of national solidarity. The poor, the inadequately housed, the precariously employed, the socially isolated have suffered most from the government's measures. Above all, the young, who are little affected by the disease itself, have been made to bear almost all of the burden in the form of blighted educational opportunities and employment prospects, whose effects will last for years. Their resentment of democratic forms, which was already noticeable before the epidemic, is mounting, as recent polls have confirmed. The government has discovered the power of public fear to let it get its own way, and it will not forget. Aristotle, in his Politics, argued that democracy was an inherently defective and unstable form of government. It was, he thought, too easily subverted by demagogues seeking to obtain or keep power by appeals to public emotion and fear. What has saved us from this fate during the 2 centuries that democracy has existed in this country is a tradition of responsible government, based not just on law, but on convention, deliberation, and restraint, and on the effective exercise of parliamentary as opposed to executive sovereignty. But like all principles which depend on a shared political culture, this is a fragile tradition, and it may now founder after 2 centuries in which it has served this country very well. What will replace it is a nominal democracy with a less deliberative and a less consensual style, and an authoritarian reality which we will like a great deal less. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Lord Sumption. Thank you very much, Lord Sumption. If you were in Cambridge, no doubt you would hear the applause. We're not going to give you a vote of thanks just yet. You did agree, I think, to answer questions, and there are 75 questions, and I had more beforehand, so we certainly won't get through all of them. So what I'm going to try and do is combine a number of issues and get your reaction to whichever bits you feel like reacting to, if I can put it like that. So where I want to start is directly on some of the legal substance that you raised in your lecture. And this sort of comes in 3 parts. First, has the government broken the law in its exercise of powers in respect of lockdown or mask mandates, etc., etc.? And if it has, how should that be addressed? And then the other side of it is, should the people be obeying these measures or resisting them? And if they should be resisting them, how? And I hesitate to push you this far, but I'll put it this way, do you expect civil unrest as we get towards Christmas and New Year, even if you wouldn't go so far as to recommend it?
Well, the first of those questions, has the government broken the law? The government has, in my view, passed regulations which it had no power to pass. They are therefore liable to be quashed on judicial review. I have not suggested that the government could not have done all the things it has done under other statutes, but it would have had to submit to a much more stringent regime of parliamentary supervision, which it didn't want to do. Now, when one talks about breaking the law, one sort of has in mind people being carted off to prison by policemen. This isn't that kind of situation. It's a situation where the government has purported to exercise a power which it doesn't have, with the result that its acts are simply a nullity. Resistance, well, as you remarked earlier this evening, Sarah, I am in Milan, where last night there was serious civil unrest in the main public squares, and there have been in many cities in Italy. I don't expect this to happen in the United Kingdom. I would be very surprised if it did, because we have a very different tradition about how to behave on the streets and about the appropriate measures of political protest. I think, however, that, and this brings me on to the third part of your 3-part question, I think, however, that people will respond to some of these rules by simply ignoring them. That's the form which I would expect resistance to take. People, I personally do not believe, and others will disagree, that there is a moral obligation to comply with the law simply because it is the law. It seems to me that there are circumstances in which there are more powerful considerations the other way. It seems to me that when you hear ministers, for example, discussing the question whether people should spend Christmas with their families, as if the right to spend Christmas with your family was a kind of boon or gift or favor conferred by ministers out of the kindness of their hearts, you have to ask yourself, what are the moral limits of the government's power, even by lawful regulations, let alone unlawful ones, to control the private lives of individuals? Personally, I think that some of these regulations go well beyond the moral rights of government, and I would not be at all surprised if they were widely ignored. One of the striking things is that although polls show that there is still a majority, although a much smaller one, supporting the government's measures or indeed asking for them to be strengthened, people's actual behaviour is different. The behavioural scientists on SAGE have reported that the rule of six, for example, has been widely ignored. And I've no doubt that the same will be true of any attempt to stop people spending Christmas with their families.
Can I follow that up with a question that goes a bit further in the sense of how the public tends to respond to rules, complying with some, disobeying others? Do you think the courts fear flying in the face of public opinion when they're deciding to uphold the law or the rule of law, depending on the sort of issue? So, for example, the question came from an Australian. There are closed borders between states in Australia that have quite a lot of public support, and some queries about the legitimacy of imposing those closed borders. When that eventually gets to court, will the judges be a bit hesitant about finding the imposition of the borders are wrong?
Well, no judge will ever admit to being influenced by public opinion in the resolution of a legal question. But it's a matter of daily experience that in practice, judges are much more reluctant to interfere with decisions for which there is wide popular support than others. I think that is unfortunate. I think that judges need to be fearless in applying the law, particularly in a case like this, where the government could have done what it has done perfectly lawfully, but chose to do it in a way that evaded parliamentary scrutiny. So the answer is, in general terms, judges are often more strongly influenced by public opinion than they either ought to be or will admit to being. I very much hope that in an issue as important as this, they will apply the law as it is.
And then going very, very much wider than your lecture, there is a plea really from the students and the young lawyers I sent that really what could or should that generation be doing about ensuring constitutional safeguards remain in place and that we have a less authoritarian regime. We sort of stop this process in its tracks if it is a direction of travel.
Well, in a society like ours, which does not readily resort to violence, as some European countries do, there is not a great deal that they can do other than support judicial reviews in the courts. Some of the things that I have criticised seem to me to have been beyond the powers of government. Some are not. They are simply objectionable. And I think that all that we can really do in a society which essentially believes that political protest should be peaceful is to be politically active, to engage with MPs, and to be prepared to protest visibly, but not violently.
Do you think that, I'm not quite sure how to word this, but you appear in the press reasonably often, and yet it would be my perception that the views that you express don't get equal hearing with the views that perhaps persuade us that we ought to be fearful and that there are things we should be afraid of and rules that we should comply with. And I don't know that I'd go so far as to say this is part of the cancel culture or ostracism of certain ideas, but there is a sense, I think increasingly, and one of the questioners asked about this, that apparently political scientists about 10 years ago began to talk about opinion corridors. I hadn't heard this expression before, but you know, the narrowing of a range of ideas which it's acceptable to talk about. Do you think that that narrowing of the range of acceptable ideas is happening in our culture? And do you think the press contributes to it? And do you think perhaps the lack of an opposition contributes to it?
Well, the lack of an opposition certainly contributes to it. I think that there is a much more powerful tendency now for only certain points of view to be regarded as acceptable. I certainly cannot complain about that in my own case. I have written my views, by now fairly well known. I have written and expressed them in 5 different papers at different times since March. Complaints about the one-sidedness of the government's project here have been made most commonly in the context of the BBC. I think that the BBC does tend to give undue prominence to the more alarmist views, and there is a fair amount of self-censorship. But I have to say that I have frequently given interviews on the BBC on programs which have dealt with the matter in a perfectly balanced fashion. So I think it's light and shade, but no generalization in this area is going to be completely true. There is certainly a growing intolerance of people who step out of line in public opinion. And I think that's highly regrettable, not least because it tends to rule out what may be constructive thinking about how to get out of our current impossible position.
And I've got 2 questions that seem just a bit random, but I'm going to ask them anyway before